Hey everybody, this is Rydo and we're back to Dear Esther Landmark Edition. So we're at the halfway point, we're in the cave now, listening to the developer commentary. In the previous chapter there was a lot said that just struck me as being absolutely wrong, either factually wrong or contradictory to what other one of the other content creators had to say. A big part of that certainly was that they were saying that the radio tower was supposed to be this thing you could always see and would guide you in the direction to the next move, where in this cave you can't see the tower. In fact, they even have a little cutscene when you first fall in this cave in which you're looking through this eye-shaped hole, so it would have made a lot of sense if you actually could see the tower, or at least even see a shade of red of the communication tower reflecting. But no such luck. We're looking for the urns still. Inherently,
the caves in the game are really interesting
I
because
want to play a game without looking at the achievements first.
Within
but then the achievements may lead me to play a little bit more of the game.
More organic, more surreal, dreamlike landscape compared to what you used to before this point. It's we kind of used the visuals and this kind of unreal theme very subtly, but here it's kind of at the forefront, and it's, to me, has kind of been designed as this kind of journey through the inner self, through the body, and it's really designed to be a very different experience compared to the rest of the game.
Now, arguably, I would say, yes, this is a different experience, but every chapter should probably be a different experience. And this is hardly that surreal. When you think of, when I think of some of the crazy locations and different worlds of the Myst series, when you're on a completely different planet, it feels like, that's more in lines with what I think this probably should be. Definitely, again, it feels like caves exist simply because caves are something that you could have done with a Half-Life 2 mod in the original version of this game, not because caves make sense to the narrative. And crouching here exists both basically because crouching exists in Half-Life 2. Not because it makes a lot of sense. You could have justified the caves a lot better if there had been, say, an audio puzzle and you had to listen for your way out. And then that could be an overemphasis on the audio, and then you could have the audio occasionally play traffic noise or something like that to lead towards the overall narrative that I think you should get from this game, even though a lot of gamers may not get that overall narrative. It could be that the caves were supposed to indicate confusion in the mind of the main player, but we are effectively in the third chapter of the game. It should be more straightforward if the main protagonist is supposed to be more confused, or it's supposed to be obvious that the main protagonist is more confused. To the point where this game probably would have started fairly well if there was a cinematic cutscene where he just fell down and hit his head, or he just stood up and it could be interpreted that he had fallen down and hit his head and he was confused because of that. Or you just woke up in an area. This looks like this might be slightly different from the version I saw before.
This, for me, is probably
the
most pivotal music cue in the game, and it's the one that most people write to me about to say that they are absolutely obsessed with and they love. It's the only music cue that has singing. It has a female voice, and I think that's a really important shift for me, that you've gone from this beautiful string music, but it's quite abstract, into what is effectively a song, and with lyrics, so you're actually explicitly saying something as a composer at this point. The other thing that I think it's important to say for me is it's the biggest shift from the music that I wrote for the mod. It's the same music, but the act of having it sung by an amazing singer. I sang it on the original and it's really bad, and Clara Sanabras re-recorded it, and it's what good actors do, it's what Nigel Carrington did, it's what good musicians do, and they take something that you've created and they just shove it up into the next level and make something that's good into something really extraordinary. And also for me, I think it's a point where the environment art and the music just meld so beautifully and so seamlessly into one. I mean, on a personal level, I've played the game hundreds of times now, and I still enter the caves and I look at Rob's work and I'm just absolutely overawed, just gobsmacked by its beauty. And I just think it's a really magical moment in gaming for me, actually. I know that probably sounds really dramatic, but I just think it absolutely hits something where everything just works together. And the music is so dreamlike. You know, Rob has talked about the journey through the body, and I think that's absolutely, for me, the music becomes so organic and fluid and actually very feminine and female at that point. You're hearing the voice of his love.
So weirdly, you don't get that audio cue though while that whole dialogue is playing, and yeah, I really didn't get anything here. Like, there isn't an object that's always here in the center that you're supposed to find. If anything, this central island feels like it shouldn't exist, and instead there should be just a pool, maybe even with just a moonlight reflecting on the pool onto the walls in different angles, or you could have just had a very small island with just a candle in the middle. Clearly what they're trying to have you look at is all of these writings on the wall, but the writings on the wall don't really mean anything. It feels like there's less chemical versions that we see this time and more circuitry patterns, but none of it really seems to matter, nor does it seem to reveal anything. You could make a guess that maybe you're supposed to interpret this, that Esther herself has gone on this journey and that this whole island is a journey towards heaven. You almost would have to explicitly say that's what happened, towards some kind of afterlife, maybe not heaven, and that Esther drew all of these and now you're just following and seeing what Esther drew in her passing over. Which I guess that might change the narrative of the story a little bit to say Esther died and then this guy died and that's where the game started, versus what you would just more literally interpret it as is that Esther died, then the story happens, then this guy kills himself and dies and imagines himself turning into a bird, or literally turns himself into a bird, however you want to interpret it. But there's still really nothing around the circuitry diagrams. There's nothing around the chemicals, nothing around the cell/plant diagrams. There's no real variety happening. Seems like maybe 4 or 5 places in each chapter have randomly specific spots where items randomly spawn that don't matter at all. And really we're just looking for the urn. I'm obsessed with achievements, and that's why I'm looking for the urns, as most people who were in that Xbox 360 era when achievements were first introduced and Gamerscore was introduced. But it really has just become an insanity that I've long since admitted is unhealthy and not really usually that helpful as far as adding to the quality of video games. A game that is too short, like Dear Esther, and lacking in interaction has achievements that then push you to play it more than you naturally would. Naturally, without the director's commentary and achievements, I would have just played this game to the credits and been done and had that experience. A lot of gamers don't even make it to the credits in most games. It's about 70% at best as far as your average gamer on your average game making it to the credits. But then achievements only make it worse when it comes to overplaying a game, investing too much, spending too much time to the point where familiarity breeds contempt. In that many games have achievements where you're doing silly things that you just never naturally would do, or you're doing very time committal things that take way too much time, way too much grinding, or you're doing very difficult things, just playing the game on a higher difficulty when it isn't your natural desire to play a game at a higher difficulty, or beating a game on every level of difficulty. Now it's kind of weird to have a fall to start a chapter and have another fall to move this chapter forward.
Caves in games into pre and post Dear Esther. I think that it's just a way of breaking away from reality into saying what you can do with these spaces that actually makes them this incredibly, much more vividly colourful and much more kind of interpretative and look from it. And it's really interesting that I look at caves now in games and I find myself going, that's a very Rob Briscoe cave. And I think that's an amazing thing to have achieved. So I think it's one of those, it's great paying other people's work compliments. I enjoy that because you never feel like you're being big-headed about yourself, but I think it is, I think particularly it does come again down to that blend between the audio and visuals that just, it's a real high watermark. I kind of, it's one of the areas in all of the games we've made that I'm most proud of.
I think as well, you think you know what you're getting with Dear Esther for the first 45 minutes of the game, wherever we are at this point, and then you step into something
they think it would have only taken 45 minutes to get to this point.
New, and I think it just throws the player such a curveball in such a wonderful way.
So there's a whole section here, and unless there was a command code or a clipping through the wall, I just don't know how you would reach that section. There's no other exit. You walk around in circles here, and you came on the left side. And so unless there was a path I missed over here, which maybe the crouching tunnel there indicates that I shouldn't bother to go back. Like, you're gonna fall down going this way. You're probably gonna fall down going that way. So the only thing I could think is maybe you come back around at some point and you're back here. Reach that. I mean, the best I could do is just try and hug the ledge here. And that's not going to work. I will say, yes, this is an interesting looking cave waterfall system. For the small percentage of games that have cave waterfalls in them, it might be nicer to see games that have more visual polish for that, but inherently making caves look better is just going to come at the cost of less focus on making forests look better, or overworld buildings look better, things like that. I mean, there's just kind of a reason why you don't spend that much time in caves in most games. This clearly is a shear wall. You can see there, it looks like there's a whole path here.
I just want to say that I think you can divide caves in games into
push
pre and
there
post
and you
Dear
just
Esther.
fall.
I think that it's just a way of breaking away from reality into saying what you can do with these spaces that actually makes them this incredibly, much more vividly colourful and much more kind of interpretative and look for it. And it's really interesting that I kind of
they're saying it's like vividly colourful
in games, and I find myself going, that's a very Rob
it's very
cave.
natural.
And I think that's a really an amazing
amount of
thing
color.
to
I
achieve.
suppose
So
there's
I think
moss
it's one of
and
those.
there's
It's great
wet
paying
rocks,
other people's
but
work compliments. I enjoy that because you never
it's hardly
feel
like
being big headed
there's
about yourself, but I think it is
glowing
I
rocks or
think
quartz crystal.
Particularly, it does come again down to that blend.
This
between
is
the
really
audio
just a
visuals that
commentary
it's a real
of
high watermark. I
of them really
it's
patting
one of
themselves on the
areas
back
in
for
all the
doing
games we've made that I'm most proud of.
very
I think
little.
as well, you think you know what you're getting with Dear
Yes.
Esther for the first 45 minutes of the game, wherever we are at this point, and then you step into something completely
I feel like this
unexpected
director's
and completely
commentary
new,
is
and I think it just throws the player
hurting people's experience
such a
and my
curveball
experience
in
of the
such a
game
wonderful
because
way.
it's really them trying to sell me on what I would consider a load of bull about just the level of quality and the level of visual polish that we're seeing here. For a 2017 game even, there was better looking games and way more interactive games, even in this remaster. Even when the original version
I think
came
when you're
out,
designing
there
a
was
game, it's very
a lot
easy
of other
to get very locked into what the
games
system
that
can
were
do.
better to
And
use
you're
as a
trying to deal
reference.
with all the different variations of things that if a player does this, then this, and we have to deal with the consequence here. And our lead designer, Andrew, and I talk about this all the time about you might have an idea, but then how does this radiate out throughout the entire system? And you get very caught in the idea of what the system has to be and how robust the system has to be and this kind of thing. And I think what's really important as a sort of a designer, as a creative, is that understanding that actually the real game is happening in the player's head, and that the system can be whatever you want it to be, but if the game isn't running in the player's head as opposed to on the screen, then you're missing a trick. You're not letting the game be everything it could be. And I think the great thing about working with a game as simple as Esther in a way is that those sort of consequences of player interaction, there's not a huge number of them in the way that there might be with a very mechanically complex game. So you can really heavily focus on what is the game experience that's being played out within the player's sort of mind and heart at the moment. And there are other, sort of, I know this is a kind of a way of approaching game design that has become increasingly popular over the last few years, and like Journey was a really, really good example of that game company really focusing on what's the emotional experience of playing this game. But I think, again, it's probably one of the reasons why Esther has lasted as long as it has done, because it's not a mechanical exercise, it's an exercise in trying to inspire you as a player to have the deepest experience and the deepest engagement and to really run the game in your own head rather than being something that you're sitting 6 feet away from kind of interacting with. I hate interaction as a term for that. I think it becomes very cold and mechanical and systems driven, and really interaction is completely trivial and pointless if there isn't an emotional engagement with the player and you haven't moved it away from the screen and into the player's head.
So basically he's admitting that he has a disdain for interaction, thus he made a game that is a walking simulator and doesn't have interaction. So you curved around. It's also worth pointing out that this running water sound effect, a little loud, like probably would be nice if it had been turned off during the conversations and the commentary, or at least turned down. Yeah. It's very good, I guess is the phrase, the word to use, that walking simulators and Dear Esther didn't become as impactful as I think these people actually think it was. That it wasn't a case where all of a sudden sci-fi became the new genre on TV to replace westerns, and so you would see a lot of old TV writers moving away from making western TV shows to sci-fi shows after Star Trek The Next Generation really pushed everything towards that direction. Although, in all fairness, even the original Star Trek series alone wasn't the only force that pushed a lot of Western writers to make sci-fi. It was really just a generational shift. Same as happened in the past with comic books, where comic books were very often based on Westerns and mobster detective crime novels. And then there was a shift at some point to superheroes, and we've stuck with superheroes in comic books for many, many decades since then. If there was that kind of shift, and then all of a sudden you had the makers of Halo, the makers of Call of Duty, making walking simulators instead, or even being heavily influenced by walking simulators, the video game industry would be in a much worse position, and games, the quality of games, in my opinion, would be much, much worse. But the good news is that it's harder to pull that off as more and more people play video games and buy video games, because there is a solid foundation of gamers of some type that want to play what games generally are. You have the Halo players and the Call of Duty players who want to play just that. You have League of Legends players who want to play just games like that. And since there are actually several subgenres of gamers out there who like to play different styles, no one impactful game could shift the entire industry to the point where it might be shifted off its foundation and collapse, which is what I think walking simulators would have done had they become popular enough. Also, I think in the heart of hearts of most game developers, they can see through a lot of the artsy-fartsy, self-aggrandizing nonsense that's being spouted in this commentary. Personally, I would prefer if more creative commentary either gets into the weeds, where the artist talks about what software and what other artists they were inspired by to do the art, or the musician talks about what kind of music and what software that they wrote, or whether it's all in B flat or A sharp, something like that, and where the programmer might talk about what software they used and where they ran into problems. Instead, we've just had commentary that's the exact opposite of that, where he's like, I don't care about systems, I don't care about having to make a robust system to have choices. I want all the interaction to just easily be done in the head of the player, because I don't want to have to program it myself. Which does probably imply that had I taken the low path versus the high path, even in the first chapter, nothing really different would have happened. I thought that was how it was going to work.
What's really important to me is that Dear Esther started out as a Half-Life 2 mod, and if the Half-Life 2 modding community hadn't championed it and celebrated it and downloaded it a lot and talked about it and loved it, then it would never have been a game. So it's never really bothered me, the kind of is it a game conversation, because as far as I can see it, Dear Esther and like everything that's come after it has been inspired by it. This was championed by Half-Life 2 modders, and they made it what it is. And so if you've made something that the real kind of hardcore of the hardcore, in terms of these are first-person shooter modders, have gone, this is really good and really special and we're behind this, then you've already got the support of a really amazing gaming community, and the fact that they championed it, we owe them a huge amount in terms of where we are. And I'm really proud to come out of that scene. I'm really proud to be a company and to be sitting here talking about a game that started life as a mod.
Yeah, I think they're the ones that have really kind of like pushed us forward and given us the passion to be able to take it to a commercial level, and give us the confidence to make us believe that there's an audience for this kind of thing.
Yeah, is it a game argument? Probably. Very much like walking simulators potentially being used as just a derogative for games that aren't actually walking simulators, are older arguments that probably aren't that useful. On a certain level, this could be redefined easily as a walking simulator or an interactive experience, to use a different phrase, because there's no points, There's no win-lose conditions. Those would be things you would expect. There's no kind of in-game currencies of any sort. Yeah, we have some dripping here, but does that mean anything? Almost thought like worms were falling from the ceiling in front of me. Yeah, there's a lot of argument that this isn't a game. And it's barely an interactive experience in the sense that you can go left and right a little bit, but you're still very much on a narrow path. You can choose at any point to zoom in and zoom out. But yeah, I definitely would say this isn't a game. But his argument to say Half-Life modders who would inherently champion the best of their own mods to show off their own skills and self-aggrandize themselves are the tastemakers or the deciders as to whether something is a game is just incredibly flawed logic. Half-Life 2 modders aren't inherently even gamers in general. They are a very narrow subset of gamers, and they have a vested interest in making it, adding credibility to making mods and trying to pull up the idea that a Half-Life 2 mod is the equivalent of an actual finished commercial product game, which it just really isn't. This is an argument that's going to be repeated very quickly when we start to see asset flippers make terrible video games using AI-generated art and AI-generated script writing and possibly even AI-generated programming, and somebody is going to try and sell a product on Steam very quickly and make the argument that their product is as good of quality and deserves to be looked at and praised in the exact same light as teams that are hiring, let's say, 30 to 100 employees and have a publisher that is funding the development of a $300,000 to $1 million game that is going to then be advertised as a AAA game and sold. There's just a big difference there. The main difference being that a team of 30 to 100 has 30 to 100 people who have education and experience to make something actually creative from their human brains, versus an AI art generator just taking other human brain creations and making a collage and an amalgamation of what other creative human brains created. Now, the good news is that the US laws on copyright have clearly stated that something made from artificial intelligence does not qualify as copyrightable. So if you were to make a game and try and sell it, then somebody else could just steal it without any copyright protections if it was really good. So there is an argument there that will stop most developers from doing that, although developers will certainly try to push the line and say that a human and an AI work together, therefore it deserves copyright. And we'll see how the laws and the judges determine that argument to be valid or not. But the low effort developers, the people who would have a level of skill as a Half-Life 2 modder, and that really never thought that they could make money until much later, or that they could be looked at as actually being creators until much later. Those kind of asset flipper type people won't care, and we will see Steam flooded with AI generated stuff, to the point where Steam has already said that they won't allow AI generated content on their storefront, but the Epic Games Store is much more open to it, so the gaming markets in general will
Dear
get
Esther
flooded.
was my first foray into writing music for games, and I actually approached it very traditionally, so more as a film score than a traditional interactive game music score. And what's really interesting for me is that the lack of interactivity in the music was never a problem for anybody that played the game. And that's a separate discussion, but there's a big schism between game music composers of how much the music should be following the player at all times in terms of interactive music. But one of the reasons I wanted to say something at this point was that this was my little first journey into thinking about how you write music for games rather than films. So I had this song that was a certain length, and Dan said, well, we don't know how long the player is going to take to traverse through that space. And I thought, oh no, he's right, and slightly panicked. So this was a very simple solution where the song was split in half, and then I wrote some drone music that could just play for as long as was needed as the player walked through the space, and then the second half of the song would seamlessly play. And it's very, very simple, but it's quite emblematic for me in terms of my career, because it was the first time that I had to think about the player. Because with film music, it's so simple. You know exactly what's going to happen when. But this concept of interactivity was so new for me. So I kind of look back at it fondly, because it's quite a basic approach to, compared to something like Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, where that was an open world adventure where I had to really think about the player and their movement through the space. So I kind of look on this very fondly, this moment in the game.
I'm not sure I 100% like the idea of a song being split in half, just because the level design is too short. Particularly in this game, where the level design doesn't really matter. This, I suppose, is supposed to be a big, impactful cave, but it really just draws my eyes to how there's these lines of stalactites and stalagmites that just doesn't really ring true. Although I guess the whole world is supposed to not ring true. For most games, I would say the audio probably is much more subtly reacting to your actions than you would ever realize, and that's usually how audio should play, is that it should be the background score and the background noise to set a mood and a tone, but not completely overwhelm you. Now, there are occasional cases, particularly on credits, where you expect a song to stand out, or a big action scene where you might expect the song to stand out. This might be an arm, or just a paint bucket. I weirdly played a game called The Blob before this, and in that game, the more you painted with paint objects, the more the music would play another track of a song. So there was kind of this looping kind of jazz song just being improvised basically by the computer, and as you made progress, another track would play loudly for you to hear it, and as you continued to make progress, more tracks would play. By tracks, I mean you would have, say, a bass drum, a bass guitar, an acoustic guitar, a keyboard, maybe an electric keyboard too, and each one of those instruments would be a track, and you would just flip on and off of that. So that was a fairly prevalent example of the gameplay directly controlling the audio. But in most cases, your best case scenarios, you have a very impactful sequence that has audio that's still fairly unnoticed. In this game, instead of composing your own music to be in this deep, thoughtful style, which that works fine, you did have a possibility here where you could have had it be like a radio on a car. Since the eventual story reveal is that this is that there is a car wreck in this. Interesting. Looking downward, I start going backwards. You have to look forward. Letting go, the water pushes you. If anything, this game, as a remake of the Half-Life mod, I think is dropping the ball as far as the ability of the Half-Life source engine to have physics interact. Noticeably, you're not picking up objects or knocking objects over when you bump into them. Everything is fixed and just does not have any physics reacting to it. Which in games, a lot of objects are just fixed in place, and then in some games they go a little crazy and overboard in having objects have physics react to them, so you might kick an important object across the room and under a table or something if you're not too careful. I'm still looking for the urn. But yeah, if this game was more like a car radio and as randomly as we run into the occasional item, where you run into an occasional spot where the radio skips over and you hear music. I could see it even skipping over and hearing talk radio. I wonder if these are supposed to be patterns or symbols with all the crystals, or if that really is just nothing. This is a very big cave. It's important to also mention that there has been a reimagining remake of a very old game called Colossal Cave, which I think was completely text-based originally. And in Colossal Cave, which was a game I think from the 70s, you are for the most part in a cave, and yet every little opening is a little different. There's an object, there's a character, there's something you're interacting with, something new and exciting that you run into, which certainly is an interesting contrast to this cave chapter in particular, where you're traversing a cave and that's it. It's a little weird. He said his leg was hurt, and yet you never see him stumble, you never see him make a sound of pain. That could be helpful.
I don't know when the paper origami boats first came into things with
exhausted
really.
sounds or sounds of pain.
But it felt like a really amazing metaphor of taking these letters and folding them into boats and then letting them leave the island, because you kind of, you know, at this point in the game is kind of the realization is there that this isn't going to end well, and that the narrator is never leaving the island. And the idea that this kind of, again, the idea of communication, or the attempt or failing communication, or trying to speak through the coma, or whatever it is, however you want to interpret it. But the idea of putting the boat in the underground river really felt like it kind of reinforced that sort of dreamlike kind of quality of the caves, of actually there's something really sad about this one boat, because when you see it go past, you know that even the boats aren't going to leave the island. Like this is something which doesn't have a tidy, neat kind of like resolution. And there's, even if you don't sort of think about it to that sort of level of depth, there's just something, it's one of those things that I really love about games that you can do, where it's just a moment that has a really distinct emotional tone to it, that you go, there's a pause when you see that boat goes past, that I just think is, yeah, it's something special you can do with kind of media like games.
So there was urn number 2, and we stood on it and the wind blew it. So I assume that's what needed to happen. I do wish Steam would update faster as far as achievements go, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it's half the programmers' fault themselves. I wouldn't be surprised if it is actually Valve's fault, though, that there's maybe a network call that has to be sent and verified to unlock an achievement on a Steam account. That way you don't have games that just unlock achievements like crazy, thousands in a second, for instance. But yeah, it also might just be that achievements are programmed to be asynchronous and slow in how they're implemented. That way other network traffic is prioritized over them. I'm taking just as long to walk through this game the second time as the first time, and possibly even taking longer because I'm looking through for the urns. I'm getting very little from this commentary other than
in a lot of ways the caves were the hardest area of the game to actually write,
don't
because
really
we
agree
knew we
with
didn't want
half
to
of what's
have
being
much
said.
voiceover in there. I think because of the strength of the music, and this goes right back to the original mod, we wanted that to be the voice and for it to be a chance for Esther to speak rather than the narrator. And we also wanted to have this break so when the narrator came out from the caves, you had a real definite sense of something happening and that he had changed as a result of this journey. So it meant it really felt wrong to have a lot of voiceover within there, but then that made it really difficult because then it was, you had like 4 one-sentence lines in there, and each one of those had to have an absolute clarity and to really, really kind of work. So I think for me, it was really interesting. It's like the difference between writing kind of fiction and writing poetry. When you read really amazing poets and you have that incredible surgical precision where every single word is considered and placed so absolutely. And rather than being able to kind of, because the narrator rambles quite naturally, it was able to, you could kind of get into the flow of the narrator's ramble in other places in the level, and this was a real challenge because suddenly I was having to write like a poet of going, every single one of these words, every single cadence, every single sound has to be absolutely perfect, or it'll just feel like the narrator's voice is intruding on the rest of the experience. So it was, yeah, I think definitely the most challenging area of the game as a writer.
Yeah, I don't get it. It's almost like Esther had some line of dialogue in this game that just I'm not hearing. And I don't think that's really the case. So I think what they're really implying is that Esther is speaking through these symbols, but these symbols don't mean anything. Or that Esther is speaking through the music, which, yeah, you'd have to really interpret the things there. And an economy of words doesn't inherently mean you have to make 4 one-sentence lines. I feel like this would have been a level where you could have just continued to have the narrator ramble, and to say he rambles is actually, I think, not accurate. I think he kind of monologues in a few places and then is fairly silent. He may have talked more if you could walk faster, but that's about it. He could have, at this point, started to read things or talk about Esther more and be more focused about Esther, instead of being focused on more himself. Or you could have even had Esther speaking, almost like you fell down the cave and then all of a sudden you're playing as Esther, and that Esther is in the head of the protagonist. Which you could totally have had a chapter where you just were playing as Esther instead of playing as the protagonist, as Paul. But yeah, what it feels like you end up with instead is just a empty cave that is a musical experience that again is not really a video game.
The sound here is a classic case of, again, what music I think does really well, which is you've had this soft, lyrical, beautiful, epic, dreamlike music, and then the moment you come out of the caves, you're into this really harsh soundscape, and the tonal shift is very, very brutal, I think, and deliberately so. You have very little music when you come out of the caves. You hear the wind, and it's a classic case of foreshadowing. So we know from this point that things are probably going to get bleaker, more difficult. And yeah, it's something that music does really well, I think, which is that emotional signalling and signposting.
Now, here's another case where you could have had it go all the way to the radio transmission tower or seen a blinking redness from the transmission tower here. Although that would just push you towards the idea that you should be going this way. So if anything, you probably should be hearing the buoy and seeing a blinking yellow to point you in the opposite direction. Am I going to be able to avoid that?
The
nope.
sound here is a classic case of, again, what music I think does really
I feel
well,
like
which is you've had this soft,
if you, in the
lyrical,
shadows of this cave,
epic,
saw
dreamlike
drawings
music,
or
and then
even
the moment you come out of the caves, you're into this
of
really harsh
Esther,
soundscape,
or if Esther
and
had
the tonal shift
drawn
is
pictures
very,
of you
brutal,
and
I think, and deliberately
her,
so.
then
you have very little
there
music
could have
when
been
you come
this
out of the
positive
caves, you hear
love
the wind,
feeling.
And it's a classic case of foreshadowing.
That's really
so
lacking here. There's just
that things are probably going to get bleaker, more difficult.
Nothing
and
that
it's something that music
really
does
tells
really
you
well,
that the protagonist even cared that much about Esther. Like, when this protagonist as a character needs to be completely devastated by Esther's passing, and it's just kind of not there. And instead, if you're to assume that this is Esther drawing on the walls instead of just you having taken this path a second time, again, you can look all the way up here, so why are you not seeing at least the reflections of red instead of just seeing the moon? The moon weirdly does feel like it is designed to be the middle point in your journey. If you can see the moon, then you're halfway there. Symbols really are not changing. There's no commentary or anything as far as this little pond. I guess that's what you'd call it, a pond. The fact that you can swim in that is really just because you could swim in another spot when you fell into the water earlier in this chapter. But yeah. Seems like right up until this point, there's an opportunity for at least one painting to show Esther and Paul together, or in a shadow to show an actual flashback, or at the very least just have audio that plays and have Esther voiced. You could even get more artistic and say have audio played where it's only Paul that you can hear, and then there's long pause breaks where Esther would have been speaking, but you can't remember what she said. You can't hear what she said. The weirdness, the randomness here, as far as randomly generated objects, really are adding absolutely nothing to the overall narrative. This second time playing through, not having heard any of the dialogue, I'm still interpreting the story exactly the same way. Now, in fairness, if I played the game a third time and listened to all the dialogue, maybe the dialogue would be completely different and I would interpret it the second way, but nothing's really telling you to play the game a second time. Like, clearly at the beginning of the game, like a Telltale game, At the beginning of every episode of a Telltale game, they say this game is adjusted by your dialogue decisions and it adjusts to the way you play. I don't think that description is 100% accurate in Telltale games, but it's very much needed to have that kind of instructions. So if at the beginning of this game it said this game has some randomly generated audio and visual elements that change your interpretation of the narrative, we highly recommend you play the game multiple times. Say that at the beginning. Say it at the ending. Perhaps you even unlock something new in your second playthrough that you can't see in the first playthrough. That would be a way to have people engage with this game multiple times to see what variety is there, if there really is a variety there. I don't think there actually is that much variety there, though, and I probably will never know if there is a lot of variety. A more normal game wouldn't just randomize things, you would more script things. I could see a case where you play this game for the first time and then you play it as it is, and then you play it a second time, and then all of a sudden you hear Esther speaking back and having lines of dialogue that respond to the monologues that the protagonist makes, recontextualizing or guiding the protagonist towards a better ending, a different ending. You effectively end on a pretty sour note, or at least morbid note in this game, so maybe a more positive ending would be helpful. Something along the lines of it's all a dream and he's woken up in his hospital bed and Esther didn't really die after all. Or Esther died but the baby survived, and then this is like decades later and the baby has grown up and you've had this whole life. Or Esther is Esther Jr., the baby is Esther Jr., and all that. I really got nothing from the Damascus Has Fallen elements and the biblical stuff. You'd have to talk more about that in monologue.
This whole area moved, didn't it? The original mod, this was a cave right at the beginning of the caves where everything was written, and it moved to the back end of the level, and we had this long corridor that's full of these kind of it's the point of high madness, I think, in the game, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of just where you feel like you're losing the plot completely, both like visually and auditory, and you know, it's kind of like this really frenetic moment for me.
I think it's where you feel most that you're underneath a mountain and you feel the weight of that mountain, and just I loved the idea when we were, you know, putting through it of what would it actually take to do this, like to actually paint all these symbols and what is going on. And it really is quite an explicit kind of thing of madness, of going, you would have to be insane or very, very disturbed to actually do this, and what is the process that this person's trying to work through, what they trying to achieve by this. And I think it really strengthened it, making it a crawl through a tunnel as opposed to just a static location.
Yeah, I think it's the consistency and the coherence of the symbols is a lot more broken down as well. Like you see some symbols before like scattered around the environments, but at this point they're like right in your face, and they're kind of just, it's just total madness, you know. Any kind of meanings have been crossed over and confused, and you know, I think it really helps to bring the tension up at this point at a level as well. So you're kind of coming out of this dreamlike state a little bit.
Yeah, you kind of know that you're getting towards the end of the serenity into something that's a bit more disturbed than that.
Yeah. So nothing really too much to complain about that commentary. Perhaps in the game it would have been helpful if you had a monologue where the protagonist took ownership of writing this, or even criticized this to say whoever wrote this is obviously out of their mind. This makes no sense, even as a single sentence. would have been a better, helpful line of dialogue, to just see some kind of reaction and hear some kind of reaction from the protagonist when saying this. It'd be nice if he actually reacted when you looked at a lot of this stuff, instead of just being left in silence for the player to react to it, away from being a city. I don't know if that means anything. The problem here is, if this is supposed to be the peak of insanity and madness, then why is the entire other chapter just a continuation of insanity and madness? If anything, the next chapter starts to imply a return to sanity at some level, because it's less crazy. And here we have a different mud texture, which potentially could have been used elsewhere. We walk through all these waterfalls, and we're walking through muddy ground right now, it would have been interesting, certainly, if the protagonist started to hallucinate, and at some point the waterfalls turned red and looked like blood, or the mud started to flow and look like blood. More cinematic. This is a game where hallucinations of the protagonist and an unreliable narrator would have been perfectly fine. In some of these stories where the character is crazy and there's an unreliable narrator, definitely get done quite a bit in video games. There's a roguelike first-person shooter game that came out a few years ago. I don't know if I can remember the name of it, where the spoiler for it, I'll spoil a game, I can't even remember the name from it. There is a car crash where the car crashes into the ocean, I think, is the reveal, but you actually have to beat the game multiple times and do a bunch of things to even get that much of a reveal. And the actual game is that this lady is crashed on a planet, and every time she dies, it's a slightly different variation of that planet, or variation of her, and she's just going from level to level on this planet, fighting enemies and finding weapons and shooting them. And yeah, the actual car crash and the theme there doesn't really play that big of a role to the actual gameplay. And I would say that game is much more recommendable because it's a game first and the gameplay is fine, where it has very often been the case. Interesting that you can't see the commentary until you are under the water. That the water here is programmed to be 100% reflective, or potentially it's actually rendering its own texture that isn't in any way actually related to this. That there isn't anything like ray tracing actually reflecting that, which almost certainly there's no ray tracing in this game. It's too old, and it wouldn't benefit to try and put ray tracing in a game like this, although visually ray tracing might make reflections look more interesting. The light mapping that is showing these reflections, which is what I assume this is light mapping, works perfectly fine too. Yeah, first and foremost though, if you make a good game and you have good interaction, you can slap on a pretty poor story and nobody's going to care. Super Mario Bros. 1 is kind of a great example of that. Let's just go back to the beginning, or even Donkey Kong, even before that. You have a princess that's kidnapped, and you have to do some tasks to save the princess. There you have the entire plot of both Donkey Kong and Super Mario Bros. Although in fairness, Donkey Kong, the main protagonist is actually called Jumpman, and the lady who is kidnapped is actually Pauline. I believe even then her name was Pauline, and she isn't a princess. But same thing. Damsel in distress. It's the gameplay mechanics of Donkey Kong. The jumping and climbing ladders. Is the jumping and running of Super Mario Bros. 1 that made them iconic and last for a very long time. Which that is worth pointing out too. They've said in commentary several times it's amazing how long Dear Esther has lasted, but I mean it's lasted because they had a mod, then they had a commercial version, and now we have a remaster of the commercial version. I wouldn't even be surprised if there was actually a remaster before this remaster as far as the Landmark Edition, and that's why it's called Landmark Edition, which doesn't really feel like the right name to use. But so if you're just constantly reselling the game, of course it's going to last around forever and still be relevant. Whereas truly iconic games are fairly iconic even if you don't bother to remaster it or re-release it. Super Mario Bros. 1 from Nintendo really only has been re-released a couple of times. I think maybe there was a Game Boy re-release of Super Mario Bros. 1.
This is a bit more of a contentious one because we disagree on this one. I struggle with this. With the points in the caves where you duck above and below the water, and you have to have that transition of audio. And I love the audio on both sides of the surface tension of the water, but I really struggle with you breaking water because it's such a hard edge to the sound. And I don't think there's any other way around that. And you need to have those moments where you do go underwater because it's so important. But it's one of the areas that's never sat very comfortably with me because I feel like in a level which hasn't got a single edge in it, it's the one edge within it and it breaks me.
And that's why I think it's so successful, because you've been lured into this completely hallucinatory, dreamlike world, and then all of a sudden, as a player, you're literally gasping for breath. You're coming up for air. And I think when we're talking about that metaphor of the body, for me, it's so about birth, and it's about this coming through the water, and actually it's a moment of realisation for me, but you're having to go back under again and you're diving down. So for me, without wanting to sound incredibly pretentious, it's about the fight between the conscious and the subconscious and that struggle. Booyah!
There's actually a really interesting thing about that underwater section there, though, is that I don't know if you remember, but you had a certain piece of music that plays when you're underwater, and to me, I really like that. It's kind of like because at this point it's kind of like a very calm, relaxed type of a journey, and you go on the water and it starts to break apart a little bit, and it's almost like, that kind of psychosis is still there. It's not complete bliss at this point, and it helps to build the atmosphere up to this final jump.
So we're both saying that Dan's wrong?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That's good. That's the way it should be.
So, in the commentary, even they know they're pretentious at a certain point. Even they're arguing about them becoming too pretentious. Although noticeably, it also feels like the musician lady was just probably given a little too much authority to affect the overall end product. It definitely feels like this is director's commentary is drawing a picture that all three of them worked as equals to make the mod and to make the remake of the game, which it probably would have been more consistent between the first chapter and the second chapter, third chapter and fourth chapter if one person had a vision and one person drove that vision with support from the other members. Although noticeably, this game really doesn't have a vision, and it's intentionally trying not to have a vision. I feel like the cave was supposed to be the peak insanity, and now we're coming out of the cave to imply that he's coming back to sanity, and like going in the water and coming out of it almost like a baptism maybe is again trying to have a subtle Christianity element to it, but it just doesn't really mean anything to me as far as the narrative, that he would be reborn in any way from coming out of this insanity. If anything, I would probably instead give a deep thought about making this more of a horror experience in the game, if not making the whole game an experience. So at some point halfway through this game, you started to see the color palette, instead of being this grayish blue in the water, it starts to get redder and redder. So you would like start the level here with just a grayish blue, and then as you proceed here, probably have a longer hallway where the tint starts to change. Potentially have a middle spot where you come up for oxygen, and then maybe that would make you hear the audio differently. As far as I didn't even hear or notice that the audio music would have sounded really that different or broken up underwater compared to not being underwater. But by the time you're getting out of this, you should be covered in completely red water, like it was blood, if you're going to make it a horror aspect, and that you're crawling out of an accident. Inherently, this is all very focused on music, when the idea of gasping for air or struggling to breathe, all of those ideas should be here in any level, but they should be a big focus also, not just there. He should be struggling to walk because of his sore leg. He should be struggling to swim. He should be struggling to breathe and hold his breath. We should hear him gasping and struggling. Even if you were just going to have a bloody leg, that as his leg got in the water got redder because of that, that would be fine. But I would want this sequence to represent that he is covered in blood from the accident, not that he's getting washed away from the craziness, and that we're now exiting the insanity. If anything, you have almost this practical aspect that you don't see any bioluminescent paint, or just luminescent. It's not actually bio or organic, but you don't see any of that paint or scribblings on the walls here because the walls are wet and because you would have had to swim through that section. Although it would just be more insane, frankly, to swim underwater and have a can of sealed paint to bring it down here to paint even more. Which, at a certain level, that's really what it should be, is that we should be seeing scribblings in impossible places. And continuing all the way to, wonder how far you can really go here in the opposite direction before it feels like it's going to slow you down. At some point you really would just have to hit an invisible wall. But it does seem like through the cave you should be walking, so you do just hit a wall and die. Oh, and so we just totally missed 2 commentaries. So it feels like it's a timer. And so that's going to put me in a weird position now, where now I'm not going to get the achievements for getting all the commentary dialogue. Unless this reset me back. Yeah, I don't think there's checkpoints in this game. So it's a little weird. So we just missed 2 lines of commentary. little weird, I suppose, to be able to miss things like that, and a little weird to not have the random scribblings really be on this wall as you walk out of it, because it kind of feels like what happened there is you went through the insanity of your brain, and then you've been washed off once, then you fall down a hole and have a flashback and a more direct appearance of the car crash, so it does the most literal interpretation of what happened, and then we walk out of this eye-shaped cavern, which again, it feels like instead of potentially seeing the moon here, we should be seeing a reflection somehow of the communication tower. Yeah, and then inevitably I missed 2 lines of director's commentary there. I'll just play that off screen. Where we've gotten 40 out of 59 director's commentary here. We'll get 57 probably out of 59 in total. It would almost certainly be somewhat pretentious, like most of these director commentaries, and something that I don't really agree with. I've actually really enjoyed playing this director's commentary, even though it's made this series twice as long, because this is peak video game criticism that I'm able to actually interact with and respond to, where so often in video games there's such a minimal emphasis on the narrative and such a high emphasis on repetition and grinding and just gameplay for gameplay's sake, that I have often fallen into being fairly numb and just going silent for 10-20 minutes as you're just jumping and swinging away or shooting enemies. Where once you have a walking simulator that doesn't have any of that game grind, which has gotten excessive in video games as they try to push for every game to be somewhere between 60 to 200 hours long, when a lot of games would be better if they are 2 hours long. This game is probably closer to 3.5 hours long in an average playthrough, and even it probably could have been cut down to 2 hours. Or it could have been extended with more dialogue, and it would have been better, frankly, if it had more dialogue in the same amount of time, or a little longer amount of time.
This scene for me is like really, really iconic, because it kind of brings this idea of the caves being an inward journey through the body together. It's really kind of like a symbol of rebirth, and it actually brings together a lot of the visual goals that I wanted to achieve with a lot of the symbolism in the game. Like, I've talked a little bit about how the environment was kind of designed to provoke emotions, and kind of the impressionistic style gives you just enough information to make you think of things and feel things. But this is probably like the antithesis of this. And the whole feeling of rebirth here is quite strong. I know Jess.
Yeah, the music's really supporting that.
Yeah.
Because we've gone, she sings always, always throughout, we've got always, always, and then she sings never, and a moment of absolute soaring. It's the climax of the music.
As you come out of the water and the music kind of swells, and you just kind of, it is like a moment of change has happened in some way, and I think
rebirth, isn't it? For me, it's his moment of clarity and acceptance and understanding of the reality of what's happened.
And you're literally moving towards the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes.
You're actually doing that as you go through.
But the music, especially, I think before the music got layered in, that scene was nowhere near as kind of powerful for me. Like, that kind of just totally made it.
See, and I just never heard them say always, always, or sing never, so I don't know if I just don't pay enough attention to music. I think a lot of gamers probably wouldn't. It's weird that you have this whole eyeball-shaped thing, and obviously it's an eyeball. I couldn't interpret it as anything else than a human was trying to make a cave look like an eyeball, and there's really no explanation or even the commentary towards that. And the idea of rebirth through revelation of understanding your situation, it's too much of a stretch. It doesn't really feel like the main character we're playing as should be journeying through their body, whatever that means, and being reborn here. It really doesn't make a lot of sense. If anything, maybe you should make this whole section, since you already have made it, more of an emphasis around the idea of being born the first time, and then maybe you can make an argument that in each chapter you're actually playing as a different person, and in this chapter you wake up at the beginning of the cave, and the cave is actually the womb, the uterus of Esther, and you are the baby, and you are just hearing sounds as the womb of the baby, and that's the world you know until you come out of the vagina of Esther, and are born, or you come out of the stomach in a cesarean of Esther and are torn away from the dying body of Esther, which that would have been an interesting twist. Then you take that idea and you go, well, in the previous chapter, who would have that character been? And in the first chapter, you would have been Paul, certainly, but who would have been in the second chapter around the shipyard? Could that have been Esther? Then the question is, who would be the character that's you're playing as in the fourth chapter, of which I'm not sure there is really a fourth character to the story. You could play an older version of a baby Esther, perhaps, grown up. But yeah, if this was supposed to be the stomach or the vagina of a baby coming out of it, it's not the right shape. It's not the right... You'd have to rotate everything a little bit 90 degrees to get the right shape. So clearly it's an eyeball. The game... One of the games... I've mentioned several games and not remember the name of them. But one game that I have a hard time recommending people play it, but I'll do it anyways for artistic and creative legitimacy, is called Trauma, and that is effectively a walking simulator around, I think, a car crash. Also, car crash is fairly common as far as elements as to why you would have a conflict or a significant event happen. Yeah, you always fade into a new section, so this could be now you're playing as older Esther, trying to figure out what happened to her parents, who may be passed at this point, or figure out what happened to her mother who passed. But yeah, I would recommend playing Trauma. The reason I am a little hesitant on there is that it was one of the earliest games I tried to record and stream, and it was a game that intentionally the creators would content ID block or claim the music on. And for one of the earliest games I tried to stream, I took that probably a little too personal, that they seemingly didn't want anybody to criticize or talk about or show their game because it's fairly short. But I would say the audio in Trauma is better than Dear Esther. The story in Trauma maybe is even less concrete than Dear Esther is, but the narrative I think is a lot better in Trauma, so I would definitely say check out that game if you're enjoying the idea of Dear Esther. If you want to see a contrast to that kind of game. Anyways, yeah, we now are in this bad position as far as achievements. Well, I'm in this bad position. I don't know if the audience really is, in that we've missed 2 director's commentary, and you have to trigger all the director's commentary to get a to get the achievement. We've missed the very first urn, and we've missed a dialogue point, voiceover point, which is almost certainly in the first chapter too. So I am now in a situation where I am going to have to play the game in part, where I'll have to play about a third of the first chapter, and then pretty much all of the third chapter with director's commentary on. And honestly, I guess I'm going to have to play almost all of the first chapter to get the urn to unlock also. So for a third time, I'll have to play the half of the game, which that's asking a lot when this barely is a game anyways. I'm hoping in the next episode maybe we could get more down-to-earth commentary, something I could relate to, something I could agree with, but I doubt it. I wouldn't be upset if it's just 100% spoiling the story and explaining all the different variations of the story and the narrative that you could possibly have, if there is even a charter. It's important to kind of think here too that there is a 2D video game that isn't so much a walking simulator called 999, which is part of a trilogy called the Nonary games, and they all play this way, where there are branching timelines based on who you decide to pair up with and dialogue choices and who you decide to communicate with or side with in certain decisions. And this is the kind of game, Dear Esther, that would have worked fairly well in that format. 999 takes it to a very far extreme and does it fairly cheaply because it is just 2D cartoon anime characters. But there is actually quite a lot of dialogue that's not voiced, unfortunately, but it's way more words. Easily 40,000 words, I would suspect, or at least 20,000 in 999, where I would suspect that you're pushing maybe 15,000 words in this game. I wouldn't be surprised if there's barely even 1,000 words in this game. But it pushes each branch in a very extreme direction, where there is a killer amongst you in 999, and of the 9 protagonist characters, almost all of them end up being the killer. So there is a reveal based on your decisions that somebody is crazy and that they're the killer. In Dear Esther, you could probably only have 4 characters branching paths with the true story, and in 999 and a lot of visual novels with these kind of branching paths, that often is the case that there's one true perfect ending, good ending. In Dear Esther, the true story could reveal that Paul and Jacobson are the same person, and Esther and Donnelly are the same person. And you could certainly have a narrowing of the branches at the end of the true ending, in which you would have to see 4 false endings to Dear Esther, where Paul, Esther, Jacobson, and Donnelly all end up being the bad guy in some way. and then you find some truth in that false ending that would unlock towards the good ending. Of course, this game doesn't even give you a compass or map, so it potentially giving you a branching tree map to show what endings you've gotten would be extra work. But yeah, that's probably what I would think about doing with Dear Esther, is have a story, have a bad ending where Jakobsen just dies of sickness and never finds out much of anything, but maybe he finds out on his deathbed, he whispers Paul. Then you have a second playthrough where it's much more focused around Paul, and you seek out things focused around Paul, and then you get an ending about Paul, and at the end of that, Paul whispers Esther, and then you have a playthrough where you are focusing in on finding information about Esther, and then at the end Esther fails and she whispers Donnelly, which is her own name, so that really wouldn't make sense. It would be Paul whispering at the end Donnelly, and then at the end of the Donnelly story, bad ending, you would whisper the name Esther, and then you'd play as Esther and she would whisper Jakobsen, and then you'd play as Jakobsen to unlock the fourth key to unlock the good endings. Which, yeah, effectively the achievements in this game are forcing me to play this game 2.5 times, branching paths and a focus on specific characters and finding out secrets about specific characters could be a way to get players to play more. Of course, inherently any suggestion I make right now is just screaming to me being more ambitious than the creators of Esther, because I would have, if I were going to make branching paths like this, I would heavily try to confuse the player and make it feel like Esther is sleeping with Jakobsen or Esther is sleeping with Paul, and that there's an affair happening there, which it did seem like one line of dialogue maybe implied that, but that's about it. Donnelly as a character in my playthrough didn't seem like he was involved with Esther or Jakobsen or Paul at all, and just felt like he was potentially a character who was on the island hundreds of years before the other characters. You could certainly have told a story where there was two people via a myth of two people on this island, and then it be revealed that the two people on the island actually are Paul and Esther. But yeah, I would have potentially, as a game director, had a writer or a writing team and thrown a lot of spaghetti at the wall and thrown a lot of ideas at the wall, and I would have tried to get people to make a game that was much more ambitious overall. But that's not what a modder is going to do. A modder is going to live within the limitations of a modding programming language, which is extremely limited compared to programming. So as a creative idea, throwing out a creative idea is easily shut down and shot down because you just can't really do it in a mod, or you just don't really care to do it because you're just making a mod, something simplistic. Another thing, as I'm wrapping up here and going on too long, is in this landmark edition in particular, if you might have struggled to bring back the voice actor of the main protagonist. If Esther is never voiced, though, in the game, the landmark edition would have been a great point to bring in a new female voice actor and say, you voice lines for Esther. And then say, this game is effectively twice as long as the original game, because now we have an option where you play as Esther and you select whether you're playing as Esther or Paul or Jakobsen, whatever name you want to pick. Or you could even randomize it, or sometimes you're playing as Esther when you start, sometimes you're not, although that's a poor choice, poor way to implement things. Or you just have the main game play out the way it was, but then have Esther speaking as a memory in between all the monologues that happen when Paul is talking. Anyways, I don't want to go on any further, so that's going to be it for this recording. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment, and watch every second of my videos. If you want to support me further, there's a link down below in the description box. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening.